All right, we're finishing out our book report on C.S. Lewis's The Reading Life. We're probably gonna breeze through the second half, like I said. Unlike the first part where we went section by section, um, I read the whole section and it didn't flow as nicely as I would have liked for that. So if you haven't read the whole section, following along is going to be hard because there's going to be some jumping around. In the first draft I did of this, I was like section one to the fifth section. Then I realized that was all clutter, and what really mattered is tracing Lewis's arguments and things that were interesting to me. So we're going to go ahead and move forward. We're going to start with what I think Lewis is saying here that tracks with the first part's argument, right? Lewis says that beauty was not in books or music, it only comes through them, and that the first demand of any work of art makes upon us is surrender. And basically, that buy-in to that myth or whatever new reality you're accepting for the art. The important thing here is that Lewis notes you're not going to know if a work of art is worth your time or is even good until you surrender to it fully and get yourself out of the way, he says. So this is the central thesis of the first part, right? A story isn't good or bad on its own. You need to interact with it and see it from a point of view outside of yourself to understand it. Most literature, according to Lewis, was made for fun, right? And if we are not using it as it was meant to be used, he says, all our criticism of it will be pure illusion. Much bad criticism, Lewis says, indeed results from the effort of critics to get a work time result out of something that never aimed at producing more than pleasure. This really drifts away from his main point, but it's important to focus on because he's saying that, all of your criticism doesn't really matter so much as reading the book for its intended purpose and getting in and viewing it from outside of yourself. This backs up something that, if we talk more and more about reviews, critics, theory, and things like that, you're going to find out that a lot of modern criticism is kind of a giant waste of time. Not in the sense that you shouldn't read it, but in the sense that what they're doing, they're often not approaching a work or a piece of literature or a television show or a movie for the same reason you are, right? It's like look at Rotten Tomatoes, for example, and just the difference between the critics and the audience score. It's why you see a lot of movies award shows that give movies that perform poorly really high marks. Critics are approaching things differently than you as the reader will be approaching them. And for Lewis, the way that you're approaching it, you're reading this, you're trying to understand it to, get beyond yourself is better than the critics. There's a section in the second half here called Literary Snobs, which was interesting and I wanted to read it. And even though I might joke about myself being a bit of a snob and a bit, a bit like ivory tower, artsy fartsy, I actually really kind of dislike when critics approach something with a very high minded reading of something as a pure mental academic exercise. Lewis puts it this way, saying, some critics write of those who constitute the literary many as if they belonged to the many in every respect illiterates, barbarians, crass, crude. And, Lewis says, I do not find this borne out by experience. I mean, we probably all kind of agree there, right? People who read popular fiction or watch popular movies aren't dumber than those who read this high minded artisanal theory, right? We're often dealing with regular people, and regular people are oftentimes, well, we won't say oftentimes, right? There are regular people who are smarter or nicer than the people who spend a lot of time trying to find secret double meanings in things like Harry Potter. My favorite example of this is there's an essay called Should We Burn Babar, the children's book. It's a nearly 20-page essay that at the end of it, the author is patting themselves on the back by saying, I don't think we should ban or burn children's books. I'm willing to bet you, outside of this very high minded, what I'm calling artisanal theory, most people are going to agree, yeah, we don't burn children's books. We, in fact, as a society, don't burn books. That 20-page essay and all of the time and academic exercise that went into it, it's interesting. Like the other like 19 pages of it, I actually forget who the author is. The author is talking about some interesting things, but it misses the entire point of the literature. Uh, Another one of these essays came up because Lewis actually talks about another piece of literature, Huckleberry Finn. He only has like a paragraph in this second half where he talks about, looking at it when, in the book, Huck is, got this moral conundrum and he decides to be good, right, by following the law and betraying Jim. And it's in doing so that he realizes that the law's wrong and that what he did wasn't the good thing. And Lewis talks about how this is good literature because it's going down to a very depth of all moral problems. What is good? Like, are obviously not all things that are legal are good. How do we determine what's good and bad? And in that one paragraph breakdown of this central moral conceit that happens here is a much deeper and I think more valuable insight than. Now I haven't read Leslie Fieldler's infamous "Come Back to the Raft Again, Huck Honey" in maybe about 10 or 11 years. So maybe my recollection of that essay as not a particularly worthwhile essay to read is uncharitable because it's been so long. But essentially the thrust of the essay, or at least what sticks out and what you'll see if you look it up a little bit, is people talking about, Fieldler is in this essay positing, homosexual undertones between Huck and Jim in the book. But that essay has these contemporary blinders on that one paragraph talking about, the very depth of the moral problem of what is good overlooks, because Lewis is looking at the book as this timeless story with themes and meanings. And what I remember about this essay 10 years later doesn't go deep at all. It's this very surface level read, death of the author. What does the reader see in it? So I may not be giving Fieldler's work the scholarly seriousness it deserves. I've actually ordered an anthology of Fiedler's works just to, be fair, reread the essay when it gets here, and maybe my opinion will change and I'll be like, oh no, I'm only remembering the sensational parts about it, and there was actually some good analysis and discussion here. But that's kind of the point, right? I didn't need too much from Lewis to get to the heart of, what is good. That was the key part of that section, like Huck coming to that realization. And we don't need high-minded theory to get to that. So this is why I think Lewis goes on to say, art for art's sake is balderdash, right? Art either exists for innocent recreation or to speak to a moral or religious truth. Lewis does list both moral and religious truth separately, right? But the more you read, the more you realize that there's not too big of a difference to him between that. But the other thing is that innocent recreation for Lewis is a much broader idea. He's not just talking about, no, you read it to just, fill time because, oh, I've got nothing to do, so let's pick up this book and, see what happens next, right? Art for him that's created for innocent recreation is going to include things like science fiction, fairy stories, poetry, fantasy, as well as things like we talked about before with like the boys or girls school stories. Like that's a huge broad range of art that is, from Lewis's point of view, it's there for innocent recreation, right? It's not necessarily being written because I want to write the next great American novel. Now, some of those are probably very good, but a lot of things that are written for purely crass commercial reasons because, hey, my target market is this, turns out to be really good. And speaks to, those truths that Lewis talked about earlier. So he's not dinging things just for, being artistic or flowery. You can read his works and you realize that he sees a lot of value in metaphor and beauty and things like that. So when he says innocent recreation, I don't want you to think he's writing off the vast majority of art. What he's saying is that if you make art to be artistic, you might be missing something there. Um, it's really weird too because Lewis has this obvious dislike of snobbishness, but if you read about him and he's very upfront that he's a very fussy old Englishman at this point in his life. It's this weird dichotomy because he is kind of, we'll say he's kind of snobbish, as are most fussy old Oxford deans, but here he's trying to say that there's more to art than just what you see from that snobbish outlook on life. And you get there again by coming back to the first half of the book, approaching art and seeing it from more than just your point of view. Later on, he'll also talk about modern art that we are browbeaten into appreciation. And those are not good works because they are not work at all. They are mere puddles of spilled sensibility or reflection, which is his basic way of saying that if someone forces you to like something, you aren't going to like it, especially because if you're being forced to like it, it's much different than if someone had to go out and earn your attention and say, hey, this thing, look at this thing I did and appreciate it. And you buy into it, you look at it, you surrender to it, you do all of that stuff that he talked about that you as a reader, a viewer, a consumer of art have to do. And you're going to appreciate it differently than if we've all had the teacher growing up who was like, oh no, you have to read this book and you're going to like it. Which is weird because later on he says that he kind of did moderate his thinking about the difference between what he calls high and lowbrow reading. And the novel that he says helped change his mind and make him realize that, he wasn't giving enough credit to lowbrow reading or novels and such was Tolstoy's War and Peace, which if someone told you today, oh, I'm reading Tolstoy's War and Peace, you're not going to think of them as some like lowbrow reader who's got a narrative lust, as Lewis says, to see what happens in the end. So, times have changed. And this goes on to talk about what Lewis, is talking about as real enjoyment. And he's not talking about real enjoyment for himself or what you get out of high literature. He refers back to the schoolboy on the bus reading fantasy and science fiction, rapt and oblivious of all the world beside. And this speaks to me because I was one of those kids on the school bus reading fantasy and science fiction. And even today, I'm one of those adults who, when we were commuting, was reading fantasy and science fiction on the commuting bus. He sees the importance in having kids care about any book so that they might someday care for what he calls the good books, as in, those books that are more than just, you read them, you reflect on them, and then you come back into the real world. And Lewis says, still, even if you never build this appreciation for the great books, the literary canon, there's value in just reading for reading's sake. And so he doesn't want you to lose sight of that. So all of this comes back to that part in the first half where Lewis was talking about modern books being trapped in modern sensibilities. That's why you read the old books, and if it were physically possible, you should read the future books. The more up-to-date the book is, Lewis says, the sooner it will be dated. And you could see that nowadays when someone's like, oh yeah, that story is so 2021. That's what they mean. It's dated. the world of the book, and it's not necessarily bad. There are some stories that require that very fixed date and time for them to make sense. Uh, Things Fall Apart doesn't work if it's just any time, any place. The specific time and place of Things Fall Apart are what make it so memorable. We could use other examples, right? The Great Gatsby could probably work in other times and places, right? But let's go back to Huckleberry Finn. That doesn't really work in a non, slave holding South in the United States of America at that time. The story just doesn't click as well. So again, it's not bad if your story is set and fixed in time. It's just the more you make it fixed in that time, it's going to become dated. Uh, this is one of the reasons Lewis says that he doesn't see too much of a point in keeping up with the contemporary scene or reading people who are writing at the same time he's writing just because they happen to be alive right now. Rather, Lewis is wanting to promote a truly wide taste in humanity, to appreciate in the cross section of humanity whom one has to meet every day. And that, I think, answers, if we go through this second half, the first half. So we talked to you about, how to read and all of that, and then this is giving you the why, because you're going to be given all of this stuff to read, and you need to do it to appreciate the cross section of humanity who you're going to meet every day. This isn't just reading for reading's sake. This isn't just the academic exercise. Doing this makes you better able to interact with humans. So the second and third parts of this book report here are more about the second half, sections that I'm not sure fit the overall thesis, so it didn't really fit. And then just some random odds and ends. We'll start on the sections that didn't really add to the main thesis and weren't about reading, and they happen to just be short readings on writing, and I'm a writer, so I thought these were interesting, so I figured I'd talk a little bit about it. He says in part that sincerity isn't enough to write well, right? Just being utterly sincere isn't enough. You've got to practice at it, you've got to get a style, and how do you get a prose style? We'll get to that. Basically, what he says is that to every thought can be expressed in a number of different ways, he says, and style is the art of expressing a given thought in the most beautiful words and rhythm of words. He says that originality is one of those things that if you go out searching to be original, you're going to not necessarily find it. Originality is going to come by, as Lewis says, telling the truth as you see it, as well as you can tell it. And originality is going to spring from that. It's kind of a chicken and an egg thing. And maybe, I might not strongly agree here, right? I think that there's some value in saying, I want to write something new and different. And so I'm going to spend some time thinking about what new and different thing I want to talk about. Of course, I also agree that sometimes, what was it? It was Monty Cook's CRPG. I forget the name of it. Where there were some times where I was like, this was very original, but I think it was, the fact that we were just pushing for it to be original, and it didn't connect as well. It was still a great game, and hopefully I'll remember the name by the end of this. But the point is that originality will come if you're writing and finding your own style. How do you find your own style? This was what I was going to get to earlier, but I hadn't set up the foundation, so here we go. Lewis's advice on finding your style is to know what you want to say, and then make sure you're saying exactly that. Lewis explains this further, saying, writing is like driving a sheep down a road. If there is any gate open to the left or the right, the reader will most certainly go into it. And this is solid advice for writing, right? Keep focused. If you're trying to say something, say the thing. What is it when we were learning how to write 3-5 essays? Tell them what you're going to say what you're going to say, tell them what you said. that's kind of the nonfiction version of this. But it's also true if you're going to write D&D adventures, either homebrew or any system really, right? If you leave a gate open, the players are going to jump off the rails. And so when you're designing an adventure, you need to be able to try and see these detours and either plan for them, like, oh, I don't care if the players go off on this tangent because I've got a plan for it, or maybe close it off so that the path isn't there if like going on that is just a big red herring and waste of time. And those last little bit is Lewis on writing. It doesn't really fit in the reading life. Writing and reading are pretty closely related, but the section would have been stronger if it had focused on what we talked about in the first part. Some random bits that Lewis talks about that I think are true. Some of these actually do have to do with reading, so a little more on theme. Lewis advises rereading favorites each decade. Good advice. I'm actually probably due to reread a lot of things in a year or two. It's kind of random, so that's why we're tacking it in on the end. Why does Lewis suggest this? It's kind of funny because he remembers that, in his adolescence, in his words, he says, I was simply a greedy, cruel, spiteful little animal, and imagination in all but the lowest forms was asleep. So essentially, Lewis is saying, reread things because as you get older, you're going to become a better person and you can appreciate things more. Well, you'll hopefully become a better person. That's the goal. He talks about some of the authors that he likes. He really likes Jane Austen and Dante. Uh, he, being Lewis, would probably have a love-hate relationship with the internet because he says there is nothing so nice as discussing a book with someone else, even though it sometimes produces rather fierce arguments. One fierce argument that he would probably have is that Lewis really hates the Three Musketeers, and it would be a welcome and spirited argument because I actually very much liked the Three Musketeers. No, really, Lewis hates it. My favorite quote that I found from him in this whole second half has to deal with how much he hates the Three Musketeers. Uh, Lewis says, "I don't think there is a single passage to show that Dumas had ever seen a cloud, a road, or a tree." Lewis hates the Three Musketeers. The next bit, Lewis provides two freedoms when it comes to reading. He says that you should be free to skip things in books, and here's another place I'm going to disagree with Lewis because I feel that's almost heresy. You have a book, you should read it cover to cover. Read it. He also says that you should be free to read in general. The state, Lewis says, exists simply to promote and protect the ordinary happiness of human beings in this life. This marries up to one of my favorite free speech quotes by Justice Thurgood Marshall, who said, if the First Amendment means anything, it means that a state has no business telling a man sitting alone in his own house what books he may read or what films he may watch. Our whole constitutional heritage rebels at the thought of giving government power to control men's minds. So you're free to skip whatever you want in your books, but you're also free to read whatever books you want, which comes back to where we were talking about, should we burn Babar? And I'm still flabbergasted that it took 20 pages to answer, no, don't burn books. But where that's a tangent. Maybe we'll talk about that some other time. Because I feel like right now we've covered thoroughly the second half of the reading life. We focused first on the parts that actually addressed Lewis's argument, then we talked a little bit about writing, and then just fun stuff that's scattered throughout. Doesn't really fit the argument, but knowing how much Lewis really hates the Three Musketeers amuses me. So, our next book report, not sure what it'll be. Because I try to do these book reports as actual, either philosophy or nonfiction or things like that. It'll probably be hard to do. I have a strict rule of, no talking about work online, and the next nonfiction book I'm reading is one for work. Well, not really for work, because I'm lucky enough to work in something I find interesting, and so the book I'm reading is related, but it's also so related that if I talk about it, it's talking about work, so can't really do that. So I'll probably try and tackle some more of the D&D homebrew stuff. I tried doing it live, and I just realized I do much better having my script here to read than trying to do things live. It was a good attempt, but we'll probably do it pseudo live, right? We'll have the script worked out and then we'll create it while talking about it. So the next bit of fiction that I'm going to read, because I do need a kind of light, easy read after both this and Beauvoir. I got this book a long time ago. It's sometimes I feel like stories should end, and because every time you add more to something, I only think it's going to make it worse. And I think, let me see, I think this book is going to be that for me for Final Fantasy VII, where I'm going to be like, sometimes let things end. Maybe I'll be wrong, and maybe I'll read this and I'll be like, oh no, that was actually pretty good. And the only saving grace is it can't be worse than The Spirits Within, no matter how good Life is Strange insists The Spirits Within was. So we'll end with one final quote from Lewis, where he said, if only one had time to read a little more, we either get shallow and broad or narrow and deep. And as you can see, since we've gone from ethics of ambiguity to the reading life, and next up is really potentially really bad, the Final Fantasy VII. It's not really fan fiction because it's official, but it might be really bad. I'm going with the shallow and broad approach to reading. So thank you for your time.